This is Technically Legal, a podcast about legal technology and innovation in the legal industry. I'm Chad Main, the founder of legal services company Percipient, and on today's show, I'm talking to Ayana Dow. She's senior counsel at the DeFi Education Fund. From the outside, the world of Washington, D.C. seems monolithic. It's a town of suits, statues, and the slow-moving gears of government. But for our guest today, Ayana Dow, it was a place where the quintessential lawyer wasn't a litigator in a courtroom, but a strategist on Capitol Hill. Ayana's career started in that D.C. world, and she's still in that world today as senior counsel for the DeFi Education Fund. From the earliest days of her career, she saw how policy was made from the inside. She interned at the CFTC. She was a fellow for the Majority Whip. She did the big law thing. She did M&A. But during all this, she started working on something that she believes is going to change business as usual. It's a new frontier that doesn't just need lawyers to follow rules, it needs them to help write a brand new playbook. What she started working on was crypto, and specifically DeFi, decentralized finance. This is a world where the quote-unquote people in charge aren't really people, they're just lines of code. And it's also a world where traditional financial regulations aren't keeping up. In fact, during my conversation with Ayana, she said something very apropos to crypto and blockchain technology. As you will hear, she's a very good tennis player, and is so good she played in college. She's going to fill us in on how the lessons she learned becoming a good tennis player also inform the way she handles her legal career and makes decisions as a lawyer. What she told me was, just like tennis, in law you can't stop the process. And that's exactly what's happening in crypto and why the regulations need to be updated. It's because of this very advancement in blockchain technology and crypto that its adoption by traditional finance is growing every day. And as a result, legislators are having to grapple with bringing the laws up to date. In fact, there are two bills kicking around Capitol Hill right now that, when enacted, will specifically address some of these issues. These bills are referred to as the Genius Act and the Clarity Act. So, without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Ayana Dow and let her tell us why she even got into law in the first place.
Like many others who have gone to law school, my mom was a lawyer, so I grew up kind of knowing that I wanted to go to law school. I grew up in the DC area also, so my version of a attorney was much different. I kind of saw government attorneys, lobbyists as the quintessential lawyer, and then going to law school in St. Louis, I learned all these different law firms and the different possibilities. Obviously, it's still very traditional in terms of like you pick litigation, you pick corporate work. There wasn't really that push to go into anything that I would say was innovative or like a tech background. I guess IP would be the closest that someone could get to something that was doing this type of work. But yeah, so I have always been wanting to do the policy work. I went from law school to doing a little bit of M&A, still had the policy bug, joined a government affairs group at a law firm, which I really enjoyed and got into the policy side of financial services work, which then took me to Wilmer Hale, where I got into like the heavy regulatory work in terms of advising broker dealers and exchanges. And I think that's where my real exposure to crypto in the industry started, because it was also during the Gensler era where there was everyone wanted to launch new products or be doing a Howey analysis. So I kind of got in the weeds of those types of issues there.
So you did some time on the Hill. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So while I was in law school, I was able to be a fellow on Capitol Hill. I was a policy fellow for Congressman Jim Clyburn while he was majority whip. And that was one of the best opportunities ever. I saw so many different issues, but I also was able to gain exposure to watching how policy is made. I was able to take meetings with industry folks and constituents and kind of learn what people were looking for when they went to the Hill and kind of anticipate those issues, which I was able to carry into kind of advising clients at a law firm. So that was my first kind of long-term exposure to policy for a full semester. But my first summer, I actually interned at the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And that was like my regulatory focus. So I feel like I always knew I wanted to go into the space. I think, as many folks have said, like law school will tell you that you need to go to a law firm because it's a safer option. But I think I always knew that I would end up back in this space.
And did I see correctly, you're licensed in Ohio? Is that because you worked at Dinsmore Shoal early on? Is that why?
So my family's actually from Ohio, where
Okay.
my immediate family is here in DC. So my mom and my brothers, but my entire mom's side of the family is in Ohio. So right out of law school, I started in an M&A practice group at Dinsmore and Shoal in Cincinnati. I was there for about a year before making the jump to doing policy and regulatory work in the financial services space.
Did I see correctly too? You played tennis in college?
I did, yes. So I played tennis. I think I started maybe when I was 10 years old. So that is something that has been very constant. I played at Towson University. It was an amazing experience. I feel like it is an interesting dynamic to go from playing tennis, and I've used it a lot in my legal career. It's interesting because tennis is such an individual sport and like it's very technical and you have to problem solve in real time. And I never thought that I would make that connection back to tennis, like, still currently.
That's interesting. So give me parallel. You gotta make an adjustment in real time. Give me parallel like law firm life. Give me example there how that came in handy.
Yeah, so I would say probably on the most recent project that I had before transitioning to DEF, we were working on proposals and rulemakings that were coming out and, like, just general letters to the SEC in terms of, "We may wanna launch this product. Can you give us some advice on whether this would fall within your regulatory remit?" And then all of a sudden, we'd get staff guidance, and it's like, "Okay, we need to pivot because now this entire thing we just worked on, we need to figure out a creative way to make it now fit within this new guidance that we have." So I think kind of pivoting in real time was an interesting thing that I did a lot. In crypto space, you don't see that on like the securities side. The securities laws are super old. They're pretty established in terms of traditional financial products. But in the crypto space, you kind of didn't know what the next day was going to bring or if there's going to be a statement by the division of enforcement head that said something that was kind of antithetical to something we just submitted to the commission the week prior. So I think kind of thinking on the fly was something that I would say happens in tennis because you could be up very well into the game and then all of a sudden you have a moment of breaking and you need to like figure out what you need to do next. Whether you're playing terrible or you're playing great, you still have to figure it out. You can't just like pause the match like other sports.
Do you still play tennis?
I do. I teach more than I than I play. I have a niece that I coach, so I'm working on her to make a second generation tennis
Oh,
player. We'll
cool.
see how long she lasts.
That's cool.
She
That's
likes
cool.
the outfits. That's what it
Oh, yeah,
is.
yeah. That's cool. Tennis does have some good fashion. You kind of already hinted towards it a minute ago, but I want to get in there. What's your genesis block? Were you into crypto before you started getting this kind of work at the law firm, or how did it all start?
Yeah, so I would say I was interested in the overall prospects of crypto prior to getting into the actual weeds at work. I don't have a technical background, so it wasn't the technology per se, but understanding that this has the potential to provide access to so many people who have traditionally been left behind in the financial services space. I think being in this field, most would assume, and I found this in conversations, a lot of people assume that everyone can just get a bank account, which is just not the case. Like, I have family members who have been debanked, and I see this as something that can be really transformational, so that's really what attracted me to the area, and then I was able to kind of grasp onto those projects and try and learn as much as I could, from the regulatory advisory side.
So you just mentioned too the technology is very promising. So there's obviously it's the blockchain technology that underlies crypto, but there's more use cases than just this crypto, obviously. But what excites you about it, or what compelled you to take this deeper dive in and to pursue it as an occupation?
I think that this is a compared to kind of being at ground zero, it's one thing that I asked folks before kind of jumping into the space. It's like, I feel like there's so many things going on. How am I supposed to catch up with what everyone knows? It's constantly moving. And the advice that everyone gave me was that everyone is new to this. Like, if you're going to become an expert or something, this is the industry that you can do it because everyone is still working on what this is gonna look like in the future. So I kind of think of it as, like, maybe this is what folks during Dodd-Frank felt when they were in the room trying to get regulatory clarity and basically an overhaul of the financial system. I feel like as a lawyer, those opportunities don't come up very often. So when this opportunity came up, it's like it was kind of a no-brainer.
Let's talk about the opportunity. So I got two full questions. Number one is before we get into the day in the life, what you're doing and why you made the jump. If I run into you at a barbecue and you say to me, "Hey, I'm with the DeFi Education Fund," and I say, "Okay, what is that? What would you tell me? Explain that what it is, the goal and the mission."
So DeFi Education Fund is a nonpartisan advocacy group. We advocate for sound DeFi policy. We also are really focused on educating, whether it's educating the public or educating lawmakers and regulators about what the technology is so that when it does come time to have rulemakings or guidance, they had kind of a base level understanding that is accurate and making sure that what we're describing is accurately reflected in future rulemakings. So I say that our work really does span the gamut. It's not all just about commenting on proposals. Obviously, that's very important, but we also commission studies to get a better idea of like how many people are actually interested in DeFi and interested in crypto. So I feel like we kind of have our hands in everything in terms of making sure that there's a well-founded understanding of what DeFi technology is.
Tell us how and why you make the jump. I mean, you're a law firm, got a great job, you're doing work in the industry. What makes you take a different job at a policy group that's nonpartisan and try to push the technology and the regulation underpinning it forward?
So, as I mentioned before, I'd always been drawn to like the policy and regulatory side of work. I think in big law or any law firm, it's kind of hard to live in both worlds at the same time. Obviously, firms have a public policy group and you can get projects from there while you do the regulatory work, but it's not something that you kind of can ingrain yourself in. So beyond the work at DEF itself is what drew me was really what the role would require of me. I think going in-house anywhere, it creates a certain sense of ownership of what you're working on. I think at a firm, you kind of do start to feel like you're a piece of the puzzle, but you don't really see the full picture come together until maybe much later on. But here at DEF, I get to be kind of ingrained in the business decisions, and I feel like the work is actually mine. And I think that that's a sense of ownership and growth that I needed, but didn't realize that that was something that I had actually been missing from my practice.
So I want to talk to you about something you just said about in a law firm, it's hard to really advance policies. Is that because not every law firm has a policy group, a lobbying group? Is it also because, usually a law firm's on one side of it? Because if they're lobbying, they're probably taking one position, or if they're representing a corporate interest or somebody in litigation, there's one side to it. Is that why you're saying you couldn't really scratch that itch at the law firm?
Yeah, I feel like it's a combination of both. I feel like if a law firm does have a policy shop, it's rather small. There's the partners who have just come from the Hill and they kind of are able to do the work themselves. They're not staffing matters like they are on a regulatory matter that comes through the door. But I also think being in DC, there are firms that are strictly dedicated to just lobbying and policy. So I think people see law firm as legal, strictly legal work, and then they have their policy shop and they have their lobbyists. So work does come into the law firm, and like I had that opportunity to work on policy stuff, but it wasn't something where it could be every day I'm doing policy work because obviously at a law firm you have to bill. And a lot of times policy work takes a lot of time, like we've seen with the market structure. Like, imagine having a lawyer that was billing to go to the Hill and negotiate the market structure bill. Like, it would be astronomical. So, I think it's just the nature of the way law firms are structured that if it's possible to have a split practice, but I think if you wanna fully become a policy person at a law firm, I think it's tough if you're coming up through the ranks versus maybe going to the government or going somewhere else and coming in as the expert is kind of maybe a different story.
You just said that if you have a regulatory matter, it's staffed one way. If you're working on a piece of policy, it's staffed another way. I'm assuming the policy piece is a little lighter. You might have the main person and little support. Or is that how it's different?
Yeah, exactly. That's how I would kind of categorize it. It's very lean staffed.
Now, is that because you can't bill for 24 hours a day for both of them? Is that why it's lean, or is it just because the work is different? You maybe are doing less document work or deep dives and stuff. Is that why the staffing's different?
Yeah, I think it's also that sometimes at a firm, I was lucky enough to have Hill experience and I worked at the CFTC as an intern. So I kind of had a policy and regulatory knowledge that I could offer. But if you're coming in as an associate, it's kind of hard to train someone to become a policy person. They're usually looking for folks who have been in the government and kind of know how it already works. I think your brain works very differently, like when I've worked with the policy folks versus the strict regulatory or enforcement folks. Like they're focused on the facts. Creative solutions aren't always going to be the number one choice versus on the policy side. It's like, okay, we need to figure out how to make this work.
Right, because they're trying to fit whatever's happening within the framework, right? And you're trying to influence it if you're working on the policy.
Exactly, yeah, so it does give you I think that's one of the things that I've always enjoyed about policy is the creative thinking that you can do. It's not about giving a yes or no, it's like, "Okay, this might be a maybe, so how do we get it closer to a yes or to what we want?"
So it sounds like if someone's listening to this podcast right now and they're in law school or early in their career, you would suggest, it sounds like, tell me if I'm wrong, get some work at the legislature or in Capitol Hill in DC, then go to the law firm because otherwise the opportunities might not be there.
Yeah, exactly, and I think one of the things that my mentors have always told me is always be strategic about where your eventual goal is, but all the steps that are leading up to it. I think in law school, it is really tough to do because you're being told XYZ are the things you need to do to get where you need to go. It's like either you're gonna clerk or you're gonna go to the firm or we're gonna find somewhere for you to go. I'm sure the case is different if you're in DC, like, it's a very policy-oriented place, obviously, but I would say that get the experience that you want to get. I've always been of the mindset of the earlier years and while you're in law school, you could literally do whatever you want. Like, there is no such thing as pivoting because 'cause you're still really trying to figure out what you wanna do. It'll be harder to say, like, "Oh, I wish I would have been able to intern on the Hill or work on the Hill, and I'm now a six-year associate at a firm who doesn't have policy experience." I mean, there are ways to do it. I think there's always a way to get back to where you want to do or what you, I guess, have always seen yourself doing, but I think as a lawyer and as a law student, sometimes I find it easy to get lost in and you see all your classmates, which isn't helpful, and everyone's kind of doing the same thing, and you're comparing yourself. So, I've always told people that, like, if you wanna go to the Hill and you, like, have that itch, you think it's not gonna go away, just do it. And if you don't enjoy it and you realize you don't want to do this, it's better to find out what you absolutely don't wanna do than not, like, explore those opportunities.
Right, be stuck in a litigation job 20 years in, and you realize that in law school it seemed cool, Atticus Finch, but now you're like, ah. So let's fast forward now to your position at the DeFi Education Fund. Give us a day in the life. What are you doing? What's your responsibilities? What are your goals?
So I co-lead the legal department here at DEF with Amanda, our executive director and chief legal officer. I feel like this question could change based on any day that you asked it, but with everything going on at DEF, I really am focused on our regulatory engagement, and that includes obviously the rulemakings that will be coming down the pipeline after based on Genius implementation, and obviously being mindful of how market structure plays out in terms of what rulemakings we might see this year from the CFTC or SEC. It also involves our legal preparedness, I'd call it. I'm sure there's going to be some pushback from traditional finance when these new rules are coming in place, so we're
Sure,
prepared.
no, there is. No, I'll say it for you.
Just
There
a tad.
is. There is. You read about
I
it
mean,
every day this week.
being optimistic, but yeah, so just being prepared for kind of what that response is gonna be. So if, say, a traditional financial institution does want to sue, like, how can we as a DeFi Education Fund be helpful in terms of, like, writing amicus briefs, explaining the technology to judges and things like that. So I feel like my work here is really exciting because it does span the gamut. I get to do all the regulatory stuff that I've kind of been training to do, but I also get to see the policy work play out in real time and kind of be a little more forward thinking.
You just mentioned something I hadn't really thought a lot about, but if this stuff ends up in court, which we've seen that it does, like, how do you explain to the judge about what the technology is and what it's not?
I think for us, obviously depends on the case. We've utilized very brilliant outside counsel for some of our amicus briefs where we've explained like the baseline of technology and how it goes back to mathematical equations in ancient times and how you can't kind of use some of the arguments that others are to like block the proliferation of this technology. I think that one of the things that helps us, other than obviously we have an amazing, like, small but mighty team, is that we are so focused on DeFi technology at its core. We don't advocate for a certain protocol or a certain token, like, we really just want others to understand and, like, breaking down things to simple terms as to what this would mean and what the impact would be. Obviously, our main priority has always been to protect developers in the space. So I foresee that, like, anything that comes up in terms of on the legal side, it would be to advocate and make sure that developers are protected in all cases.
That raises an interesting point. So the focus of DeFi, as you just stated, is developers. Focus on developers. Why does the DeFi Education Fund choose that versus other organizations who maybe are coming in the industry as a whole or only focusing on the financial aspects? Like, why does DeFi really try to hone in on the development aspect?
I think it's a gap in terms of how people understand the entire crypto ecosystem. Even prior to joining DEF, talking with colleagues at a law firm, we would group crypto, DeFi, blockchain, just talk about it under one umbrella, and you just kind of see that from the outside looking in, you would think they all have the same policy goals and all the same outcomes. But I think that focusing on the underlying technology and focusing on the infrastructure is something that is immensely important in the industry. And I think that it could sometimes get overridden by others who might have dual purpose or dual goals. I think that we're able to really hone in on the fact that developers are our hard line, and we can say that. And I think if we were to have another goal or another mission, we would maybe have to soften some of our talking points or some of our positions.
Oh, that's interesting. So I won't name names or let's just this is hypothetical, but give an example of why or where you guys are hyper focused at the software developer level versus, let's say XYZ.com that's a where people can trade the crypto and those companies generally have a strong presence in DC. Where do the interests not necessarily diverge, but where do their focus might go one way and DeFi is going another way because of the focusing on the developers themselves?
I think one thing that was really the transforming moment for me in realizing the differences and why it's so important is that if you were to have, say, an entity that launches a token into trade, they can register with the CFTC or the SEC. They may not want to register. There's a difference in being able to physically register and comply with regulatory obligations versus we're talking about technology. And like there actually is no ability to register because there is no person in decentralized finance, like a truly decentralized protocol. So I think the differences kind of span that way in terms of when I was advising clients, it's kind of giving the advice of these are the ways you can make it work within the regulations. And if you don't want to, kind of like that's a different discussion versus we're coming from an angle of these things are actually not possible. So what do we do to fix this? So I think there could be diverging opinions on it. Maybe on one end, you're willing to give up certain things based on, okay, my token still can still trade under these regs. It might cost more for compliance, it might cause some other issues, but it can still happen. Versus DeFi, if a rule comes into place that actually nixes it and allows it to not exist, that's a whole other issue. And I feel like that's where it becomes detrimental.
That's the distinction there too, right? You just talk about tokens. I start a token and I don't know, for whatever reason, social token, or I want to, fund a business or I want to tokenize some asset. Depending on how it's structured, there's obviously some human motivation there. So that obviously human action is subject to or should be subject to different regulation than let's talk about the tech itself. You guys are really into the tech itself, DeFi. Like, it's just technology doing transactions. No humans are making decisions, right? So there's a distinction there about policy wants and actually implications, right?
Right. I think one of the things that I've tried to do in my mind is differentiate it and like there's on-chain finance and there's industry participants who want to include on-chain compliance in their businesses, but on-chain is not DeFi. But I feel like sometimes the lines get blurred in terms of that understanding.
Right. Because one is decentralized, right? One's there's nobody making decisions, but you and I can start a token and we can make decisions about it. Like we're gonna give X to this group and keep X back for us, and then So yeah, there's I think that gets kind of lost in translation a little bit. So you've already mentioned a couple times the market structure bill. I think it was just yesterday. The SEC offered a little more guidance on what should be considered a security, which I'm going to correct me and jump in here, but basically, I think what it came down to is a lot of use cases are commodities, are not securities. But one example of a security is you're going to tokenize an asset. Twofold question. Explain the bills that are up there on the hill now that have been going back and forth, the market structure bills, and then also explain them vis-a-vis what happened yesterday. Does that affect their passage or what, chances thereof, or what's going on like as of today?
So I'll leave the speculation piece to our awesome policy team who's involved in the negotiations and the processes that go on behind like the congressional actions. But in terms of yesterday's release, I'm quite frankly still working through it. It was a really it's always funny when they just drop something huge like that, like at like 4 p.m. on a day, and then the CFTC also issued a no action letter to Phantom on the same day. So it's a lot going on, but I think that it's interesting because it kind of shows what many people have been asking of the SEC. Are you gonna wait for Congress to finish and have a bill, or are you guys gonna move forward? Because technically, I believe that some scholars have said that they don't have to wait. They have the authority to do it. It's just of how they go about it. So I take this as kind of a signal of that they are being mindful, obviously, of what's going on in Congress, but they feel the pressure that, like, this industry is going to keep evolving. It's gonna keep moving. Nothing is gonna be stand still just because we're waiting on a bill. But it was really interesting to see that the CFTC and SEC released this guidance together. It shows really the harmonization that CFTC Chairman Seelig and SEC Chair Paul Atkins have talked about moving forward. Harmonization has always been a goal between the agencies, but I think this year is what we're actually seeing it really play out and like the effort on both sides to make sure people have better clarity and understanding. But yesterday was definitely an interesting day for sure.
Explain the difference. You say, well, the agency offered some guidance versus, we just talked about the bills on the hill. Explain the difference between Congress enacting the law versus the administrative agency giving guidance on how things would be considered in the marketplace.
So something that's enacted by Congress and becomes a statute, it's more concrete and it allows the agency to implement regulations, but those implementations are still limited by what's in the statute. So it will say, clarify XYZ terms, and then that is what the SEC must do or the CFTC must do. They cannot just kind of make up new terms. It's still all limited in terms of an interpretation or guidance that was put out. They did have a section where they're soliciting feedback on any of the information that's in the release, but it could be rescinded by another administration, you know? We saw that on the CFTC side with a lot of staff letters and interpretation that was issued when Biden was in office. A lot of those staff letters were rescinded, so then you can't rely on them anymore. So the interpretation is a first step forward, but it's more so, solidifying that interpretation and that guidance in a way that can be relied on for years, and there's no concern of it being clawed back in any way.
We've got the SEC and the CFTC offering some guidance on this, and still we don't know what Congress is going to do, but in theory, Congress could say, no, we disagree with this 100%. Everything's a security and you can't do that. But how much influence do you think, and I know this is just reading tea leaves, this is guesstimating, like how much influence do you think that this will have on the way the lawmakers are making their decision? Like, well, the agencies that is charged with administering these laws and regulating this world think this way, so maybe we should give that some credence.
I think, and this will be my opinion based on just how agencies and Congress have interacted in the past. I feel like this is a different strategy that's going on a lot because of Chevron deference no longer being there. I think people are concerned, rightfully so, that now that agencies can't kind of come in and say, like, this is actually what we meant, there is still that open door to say, for a judge to say that I don't think that's correct, and we need to stick to what Congress said. So I think that that's why it's playing out a little bit differently than it did in prior market structure overhauls. One of my first things that I've looked at is like, what did Dodd-Frank say? And there's a lot of open-ended questions for the agencies to interpret and to figure out. And I don't think that that's something that people are a proponent of because there's no longer that deference to the agencies is one thing that I think is an issue, and what I've heard from just hearing others speak that there's just that fear of, okay, we don't have everything set out in market structure. What does that mean 10 years from now?
I want you to take the side of defending deference to the agency, and I'll take the other side. So we explain both sides. Like, so I think the argument would be, look, it's Congress. We make the laws. You're supposed to regulate and administer the laws. So why do I really care? Why should I give you deference? What's the counterpoint to that?
I think others would argue for in terms of having pure deference to the agencies is that typically the agency has folks there that are have the institutional knowledge, usually there for a really long time. They're in the weeds on the rules versus a judge who is relying on amicus briefs and their clerks and other things to kind of get up to speed. I almost compare it to my time at a law firm where you have your enforcement attorneys and your investigations, and then you have a specialist that you bring in to actually explain, like, if you're doing doc review, this word means something a little bit different than what you would think it means outside of this context. So I feel like that's what I've heard as being kind of the main concern. I think there's both sides have I don't really lean one way or the other. I think that both angles of the argument have a very strong, like, foundation to feel that way. Like, obviously, there could be times where an agency decides that they just want to do what they want to do, and it might not be what Congress meant. But it also could be an opening for, okay, I would rather have this judge interpret it because it might be more beneficial to me than having someone who's an expert look at this issue.
Another one of your priorities is CFTC engagement. Explain why and what that is.
So with the current market structure bill, the main goal that or the main outcome would be that the CFTC is given authority over digital asset commodities.
According to that guidance yesterday, they did get a lot of it, right?
Right. And it's something that would be very new to the CFTC. They went from being an agency that was focused on agricultural products and very traditional financial products to now being expanded to this entire market. And from my conversations and my understanding of staff's mindset there is that they will need help getting up to speed on all these things. So in terms of engagement, it really is an educational piece, letting people know that DEF is a resource in terms of what the technology is, how it operates as they get into the rulemaking phase and issuing guidance. It's funny, going from an intern at the CFTC to now, when I would say I interned at the CFTC, no one knew what it was. They're like, "The SEC?" And I'd say, "Kind of," like the sister, much smaller agency. So it's a small agency getting a lot of oversight capability over a very large market. So our engagement is really with plans to go in, meet the staff, let them know who we are, what we do, and whether it's giving demos on how transactions work on a DeFi protocol or just being there to kind of give insight to what issues that developers are facing in terms of certain rulemakings, that's kind of where we see our engagement with them.
And you just said, it's it's new to everybody, and not only that, it's fast moving, right? And I guess theoretically it's infinite. I guess any kind of business is infinite, but this is, there's really no stopping it once it gets going. So, all right, let's assume best case, which I think is going to happen, the market structure bills they come out of Congress, and you got the CFTC up and running and educated. What's next? What are you looking for down the road? What's DeFi probably gonna or start thinking about now that they probably know they're gonna have to hit a year from now, 2 years from now?
I really see this as the years of rulemaking now that we're in this. Market structure obviously is a huge haul and has taken a lot of work, a lot of bipartisan talks from all sides and folks in the industry. But even after this is done, there's mass amounts of rulemakings that are required by the bill. So then it's kind of pivoting and free focusing on the proposals that are going to be coming out. We're already seeing that with the OCC releasing a rule proposal to implement the Genius Act. So I imagine that that will be kind of where we're focusing our resources and making sure that we're producing thoughtful comment letters to any rules that come out or any guidance and making sure that everything that does come out is with our feedback going in very intentionally and that DeFi is reflected accurately.
Ayana, appreciate your time. If people want to get involved in DeFi Education Fund or get a hold of you, where should we send them?
We have a amazing website that has all of our resources, DeFiEducationFund.org. We had a weekly DeFi debrief newsletter that we send out that you can subscribe to that gives
I
the
encourage it. I'm a subscriber. I encourage the
Thank
subscription. Yeah.
you. Yeah, it gives the high points of the week and why they matter for, the industry. We also have an email that's on our website that you can send feedback, ideas. We're always open to hearing from folks. We've gotten emails of asking if we wanna participate in an amicus brief or they have this idea for an educational piece. So we're always open to helping others learn, but we're also want to learn ourselves and be the most resourceful we can.
Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that's a wrap for today's episode. As always, we really appreciate you listening. If you want to subscribe, you can find us on most major podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, etc. Also, if you like us enough, I hope you leave us a favorable review. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, this has been Technically Legal.